Hello everybody, Vince Venturella here. Wanted to make a little video that I feel is probably going to be somewhat controversial and something that people are probably going to hate me for, but that's all right. It's been something that's been on my mind for a little while in light of the ninth edition rumors. And what I want to talk about is Games Workshop as a company. And what I want to talk about is why they might be one of the best gaming companies that's ever been, and why we should all probably give them a little more credit than we do. This is an unpopular opinion, but I'm hoping that by the end of this video, I'll at least give you some reason to think about it. So this is going to be a mostly positive video, but let me start out with just a quick, sort of obvious points. Games Workshop is not perfect. They are a company full of human beings. They make a lot of mistakes. Over their history, they have made many unpopular decisions. If those directly impacted you and something you liked, then you have all the reason in the world to be negative, and I bear you no ill will over that sentiment. They have, throughout their history, had a shocking lack of communication with their client base. They communicate about as well as a picture of a deaf and dumb person in a silent movie. I think their marketing plan is somewhere between a sheet of paper that says, don't say anything ever, and just blank white paper. And I think those are probably points that are true and that everybody can agree on. And the current situation is that, on 11. Their lack of marketing only, or direct communication with their client base, only exacerbating everybody's frustration over the current rumor mill. But what I'm hoping to do today is blow the conversation up a little bit more than just this week's rumors or this particular edition or how we feel about what's going on here. And talk about why, as a company, they're honestly probably a pretty great company. By most definitions of that term. So what got me thinking about this was this book right here. There we go, I don't know if you can see it. So this is Designers and Dragons. This is by Shannon Appelkline. There you go. You can see it's a pretty big tome. This is the history of the role-playing game industry, of the gaming industry. Mostly role-playing games, but it dips its toes in other places too. This is an amazing book. This isn't a video about this, but I cannot recommend it enough. Absolutely fantastic. I believe it's now available in small individual formats, like you can pick it by year groupings, but if you can get the original, totally worth it. Shannon is a scholar of the gaming industry, and he is absolutely amazing. I really cannot recommend this enough. The insights, the background offered, if you're at all a game nerd like me, that you like the actual business of it and how it goes, there is nothing else like it that has ever been made. At any rate, the reason I say that is because there's a very big chapter in there on Games Workshop. And the first thing I want to talk about with this is that, honestly, for those of us who play Warhammer, we're pretty lucky as games go. Because what this book really is a history of corpses. Okay? The gaming industry is a small niche market, especially once you get outside of like board games that have this mass market appeal. I can sell apples to apples at Walmart or whatever. But when you get down into miniatures games or role-playing games, stuff like that, you're really getting into a very niche sector. And, just as a point of that, people often talk about subscribers or their views on these Warhammer videos. That's comical to me. A great Warhammer video, an amazing Warhammer video, has 5,000 views or 10,000 views. I think if you totaled up every view on every video that has ever been posted to the Warhammer YouTubers, you would have a single-digit percentage of like a single Taylor Swift video, right? So that's the difference between mass market appeal and what we do. Like Taylor Swift's Blank Space, as a point of reference, had somewhere around 540 million views when I checked it just for this little factoid. 540 million, that's a 500 million. Okay. So it's a niche market. Now, when I say it's a trail of corpses, what I mean is that when you look at the early history of the gaming industry, those companies don't exist anymore. With very few exceptions, and there are two notable, very small exceptions. Um, every gaming company that was founded in the 70s no longer exists. They have been bought, they have been liquidated, they have been shut down. The products that they make maybe still exist, are probably in someone else's hands, and may not or may not be true to the original. Um, because running a gaming company is really hard. Uh, and almost everybody who does it fails. Okay. Maybe not in 1 year, maybe not in 5 years, maybe not in 10 years. But the problem is this industry has a lot of change to it, and taste makers come and go. And when tastes change, it can rise and fall and crash entire businesses. I talked previously in one of my videos about the D20 system and the open gaming license that D&D created. That destroyed businesses. Some hung on, many did not. And that was just one sheet of paper published at the start of a book. Okay? We're not even talking about the broader trends of things like the introduction of narrative, of like strong narrative in RPGs, or the indie RPG movement, or stuff like that. So, being able to keep current with the times and actually find the wants and desires of a really ever-shifting market is no small task. Yet, Games Workshop has ably found themselves up to the task. A little background, Games Workshop was started in 1975. It was literally a game workshop. They meant to make games, and I don't mean like board games or miniatures. I mean like games. Like some of their early products were like little mahogany polished chess sets and stuff. That quickly ended, and where they made their initial impact was by becoming the sole importer in the UK for Dungeons and Dragons products. D&D had just come out a year before Games Workshop came onto the scene, and when they got the sole rights in the UK, it was huge. If you Google if you do a Google image search for the opening of the first store of Games Workshop in Hammersmith, you'll see a line of people around the corner. Those people aren't buying Warhammer or miniatures. Those people are lining up to buy role-playing games, okay, as well as a couple of board games and stuff. And that's where they cut their teeth. They were on the role-playing trend. They became this sole importer for not just D&D, but a huge selection of RPGs. And this is at the dawn of that industry. It was explosive. And they were right on it. And they were very successful with it. And what's interesting about the history of Games Workshop is that they have consistently managed to stay with different trends and sort of allow exploration and cut when it doesn't work. So one of the tricky parts about business is you can't become stagnant. And Games Workshop has honestly always allowed a lot of innovation amongst its employees, and they've been willing to try a lot of things. Okay, they have published all these different RPGs, novels, solo adventures. Like Lone Wolf came out of a person who was at D&D. If you're familiar with that, it's like a choose-your-own-adventure style thing. They published board games, a lot of them, some of them hugely successful. They ran a distribution business and import. And they, most notably, got a very strong partnership early on with Citadel Miniatures. They were in magazine publishing, by the way, as well. They started with a magazine called Owl and Weasel, and then, I want to say in like 1976, 77, yeah, they switched over to this magazine called White Dwarf. And it was called White Dwarf because it was a dwarf like the physical dwarf thing, but it was also a white dwarf like the star, because the magazine was meant to be about science fiction and fantasy, which at that time was much less delineated than we think of it now. It was kind of all one big stew. You think of like Thundar the Barbarian, right? Or the Thundercats, where you know, science fiction and fantasy. You got guys with swords and guys with laser guns right next to each other. It was very much a melting pot in that time period. So they've been willing to try all these things, and most game companies don't do that. They find one thing and they do that one thing, and that eventually that one thing doesn't work anymore and they die. Games Workshop throughout its history has been willing to try all these new things, but the trick to that is they have to also then cut those things when they don't work or they don't stack up financially. And that leads to a lot of acrimony at the same time. Because if you really loved that one thing they were doing and they're no longer doing it, you're now not a customer anymore and are probably not too pleased about it. And that leads me to the next idea, which is why I believe in cutting a company like them a little more slack. So they have remained in business by experimenting, by making products that people want to buy, and by generally being financially solvent and making good business decisions. But there's this element in the gaming industry that is very, very present. And it's called churn, okay? Which is a term in many industries, but it's especially potent in the gaming industry. So churn is that when you bring somebody into the hobby or into your game, the clock immediately starts of how long they're going to play that game. And it's a big spectrum, right? And it basically is a bell curve. You got a few people who will literally play for a week. You got a few people who will play for their whole life, but most are somewhere in the middle. And I don't know what the churn is for Warhammer, but my guess would be it's probably somewhere in the 2 to 4 year range. Just based on sort of my knowledge of the industry. So you are always bleeding customers. And this is a little different than other industries. Oftentimes with things like, if you consider, let's just make a completely different comparison. Let's talk about cars for a second. If a car company wins your brand loyalty, if they give you a car and you really love it, and you keep buying that brand forever, you bought a Honda Civic, you really liked it, it was a great car for you, you've come to trust Honda. But you trust Honda based on one item. That is not a relevant statistical sample. You could have gotten the one good car out of a million bad ones, but it doesn't matter. Your loyalty is now to that company. Okay? And you might buy Hondas for the rest of your life if everyone keeps having that same success rate. So ideally, over time, you couldn't have the million bad and one good situation. You would get a bad one the next time statistically. But as long as they make decent cars and maintain that reputation, you'll stay with Hondas. But games are a little different. Games are some part about exploration and excitement, and they're not just about dependability or something like that. There's some part of the game is the experience, and every experience gets old. Okay? If you've ever gone somewhere really amazing, to some special locations, it's like you go to Paris or something. If you go to Paris for the first time, it's pretty awesome. The Eiffel Tower and the Arc de Triomphe, the Louvre. If you live in Paris, you probably don't maintain that same level of enthusiasm. I'm not saying you don't love Paris or you don't respect your city. You don't have that same tourist level of enthusiasm. We are constantly tourists in the games we play. So churn. So part of the struggle with games is that you always have to be innovating and changing. If you just keep doing the same thing over and over again, you're not affecting churn. You have to be doing exciting things, new things, trying things, which I already mentioned Games Workshop is, honestly willing to do. And you have to be willing to fail and then cut that thing out. Because you have to be doing something interesting enough to draw new people in. And that group, if you want to be growing, which is, of course, the goal of a company, then that means you have to have more coming in than you're losing. And you're always losing. Like, the bleed percentage is strong. So change, especially in gaming companies, is inevitable. And that leads me to my next point. If anything, we should respect Games Workshop more than most gaming companies, because when presented with this, challenge, which all gaming companies have faced, most have tripped up somewhere. They have made changes to their game that were so radical or divisive that they accidentally flipped the switch. They made the churn too high. Because, by the way, by doing this changes, you're also then increasing your churn. Like, even good changes, you'll lose people because everybody likes something that you changed. So you have to change to get new people, but when you do, you increase your churn, so that change has to be really good to even push the new people farther. And to keep the old people, to reinvigorate the old people who did like what you changed. It's a tricky situation. And so when you're making those changes to the game, what most do is they go for like a really, really, really radical reinvention. Now, I know the irony in what I'm saying, and I'll come to it later. And for a lot of companies, that led to a bad situation. We could pick on D&D and 4th edition or anyone you want, because more or less 2nd was very different than 3rd was very different than 4th was very different than current edition, although the current edition is much more an amalgam of all previous ones. If you like the game Traveller, if you've ever heard of it, it's a really good science fiction role-playing game. But the same thing happened with that. In the desire to invigorate an old and perhaps atrophied game, they made these really sweeping big changes to the game, and they went too far. And there's a lot of backlash, a lot of people left, closed, and it eventually passed back to the hands of another publisher, who then went back and basically recreated the game as it originally existed. More or less. So, for the majority of Games Workshop's history, they have avoided that. They have instead refined the game. I talk all the time about the sharpening of the knife, and that's what they've done. All the rules get sharpened. Now, that doesn't mean their changes have been minimal. In fact, I consider some of them quite big. I mentioned again in a previous video, and a really big shout out to John Talby, who pointed out that, like, when he started in Warhammer, Dark Elves were riding giant spiders, and Elvish unit champions could take dragon mounts, and, Wood Elves had chariots, and single chaos characters could kill an entire enemy army. And, these are big differences in between the way the game was and the way the game is. I was having a discussion with Matiram in the comments thread of Warhammer Weekly, and he said that he thought the Empire army was, still a lot the same as when he started. Or he said they felt the same. And I thought that was a really interesting point, because I don't disagree with him. I honestly think they do, like 8th edition Empire does. I started with Empire 2 in 1997. I started with the 4th edition book. And I think they do feel mostly the same, which is funny because they shouldn't. In 1997, when I played the Empire, a unit of cavalry was very hard to get. They were, if memories, they weren't they were a special choice or whatever the equivalent of that was. I'm sorry, it's been 17 years, so my brain's not perfect. But a unit of cavalry was a very special thing. What you mostly had, you had no detachments. There were no steam tanks in 4th edition yet. No Hellblaster volley guns. Your army was probably some blocks of dudes with different shaped sticks, spears or halberds or something. And those blocks were not that big, maybe 20 guys, 25 guys. There were no detachments. So my army was probably a couple blocks of those dudes, a unit of cavalry, of knights, who were pretty crappy, and 1-up armor save, and that's not a thing at that time for Empire, and maybe a couple cannons. And whereas now, although you could kind of mimic that in Empire army, the Empire armies I see are there's steam tanks driving around, and there's 1-up cav everywhere, and demigryph knights, and giant magical chariots rolling around the board. So it's a very different force. When you look at the unit composition, it's 80% of the time, you might not even have the same unit on the table as you did then, yet somehow the army feels the same. So there's this consistency. Maybe that's partially in units, maybe it's partially in fluff and tone. It's hard to honestly put your finger on it, and to think it's simple is not, and is wrong-headed. Yet they've managed to do it. So that is an impressive accomplishment, to be able to radically change the rules of your game, the offerings of your products, and still make most of your players feel like what they're playing is the same. If I played Empire in 1997 and I play Empire now, I still feel like I am the commander of this same army and the same force. And maybe some of that is fluff consistency, but I'm not sure it all is, because even the story changed. Like in the early parts of the Empire, things were, different. You look at something like Bretonia, the fluff is really inconsistent on Bretonia. Like, just dig into the Bretonian history. It has changed dramatically, and even the fact it hasn't changed since 6th edition. If you look edition to edition, there's big changes. Ogre Kingdoms are another example of that, like 2 books. But if you go back and look at the fluff in that first book, it's not completely different, but it's pretty different. They were the things they were doing and the types of beings they were was much different in OK1 versus OK2. So consistency. They continue to make really good products. Again, another problem that happens is with gaming companies is that it gets easy to make bad products. So for this, I'm going to point at TSR and the 2nd edition line from, say, like 92 to 97. This is the twilight years of TSR, a giant gaming company that failed. At the end of TSR, they were making things like there's a Shi'ar handbook and just like all these crazy books and splat books and things, and they were just throwing spaghetti at the wall. And the quality level of a lot of them dropped precipitously. Not everyone. There are some real gems from that time period. But it's easy to, as a game company, to fall into that trap because you're successful. Why not just keep doing the same thing? Games Workshop has only raised the bar over its existence, especially when it comes to its miniatures. When I look at the new miniatures that I just bought, when I look at Thanquol here, or something, right? This miniature is amazing, and it was one of the just most joyful times I had hobbying on something. The Thanquol is amazing. The Rat Ogre is amazing. I was able to do conversions with it easily. It's a great product. And yes, it costs a fair amount of money, but again, it's an amazing product. There's to not only consistently deliver the same quality, but to raise the bar, is really something worthy of respect. And speaking of the cost of miniatures, let's talk about price, because this is another thing that gets a lot of acrimony. Games Workshop has raised their prices at various times, and people have taken severe umbrage with that. I am going to cut them a pass on this in every way, shape, and form, and I know this is what's going to make people hate what I'm saying the most. There are some products that are just priced stupidly, okay? Bretonian Knights, Blood Knights, 5 for like $100. Witch Elves getting 10 for 65. Yeah, those are stupid prices, okay? But the rest of the game, the vast majority of what you're buying, is honestly a really good deal. When you can buy a block of 16 or 20 minis for $29 or $35 retail, and don't lie, you know you're buying it at 20% off. If you're not looking hard enough, because there are 10 places on the internet I can think of, or where I can go shop locally and get all Games Workshop product at 20% off. That's not a bad deal. Go look at the prices on Malifaux minis, or War Machine minis, or Reaper Bones, which are touted as this cheap line of miniatures. Mini to mini, Bones are more expensive than most stock troops out of the armies. Again, there are exceptions, but you're usually with Games Workshop paying somewhere in the $2 to $3 a mini range for your block troops. So the problem with the prices isn't the per mini cost, which they had to raise to stay on par with the industry. In fact, they're still behind it in a lot of ways. You know, I bought like the nurses set for my skull cannon conversion from Malifaux. That's 2 little tiny, I mean, they are itty bitty nurses. Cool minis for sure. But they were $18. That's $9 a mini. I mean, that's up at the higher end of these of what Games Workshop stuff is. But even witch elves aren't that expensive. The problem, of course, comes in that you're not just buying those 2 things. These other games that are skirmish can afford to charge you a premium and not suffer the backlash because you're only buying 20, 30 figs. The problem with Games Workshop is that they have to raise their prices to cover production costs and actually cover profit. They have shareholders, they have expectations. It is a business. And if you were a shareholder of Games Workshop and, you know, your yearly dividends that were paid to you were based on Games Workshop success, I'm pretty sure you would be inclined to make them to have them not lose money on every single mini they print. The problem comes in with the current game and the fact that our armies have now gotten so huge, just so massive. And it's funny because in a recent thread, it was brought up that like people were looking at their 5th edition army lists, and it was like a block of 20 troops, and a block of 20 troops, and a guy, and a monster, and a couple war machines. And that was it. And that was your 2,000 points or whatever. But the game has escalated. Like, points have gotten slightly lower, things have gotten cheaper, armies have gotten bigger. And that's fun, but that also means that that barrier of entry has become nearly impossible to navigate. So the price per fig raised to either at or below industry standards in most cases. But the problem is not the price per fig, it's the price per army, right, which became very large. So I'll give them a pass on the pricing thing. And it leads me to understand why a lot of the rumors of 9th edition have said that the game it's not going skirmish. I think most of the rumors point in that direction, that there will be a skirmish entry game, which I'm very excited about. I'm totally stoked for Wartime 2.0, but that's not this video. That also then has the bigger Warhammer Fantasy Battle as a direct lead-in. And to me, the greatest crime of Mordheim was always that I couldn't take a Mordheim warband, play it, grow it, and then eventually maybe start an army out of it and just build it into an army. I always wanted to do that, and now if that'll be facilitated through the rules itself, I'm pretty excited. So, for all of these things, quality of product, relatively reasonable prices, given, again, the rest of the industry. The willing to try new things and making a lot of great things, opening their fiction stuff. A lot of people love those Games Workshop novels in Fantasy and 40K, and they fostered that. Most game companies don't do that. They contract out to somebody else. They don't really take a lot of care in the product, but it's clear that Games Workshop, for the most part, actually cares about these novels and wants to make sure that they are putting out a quality product. And most importantly, just being in business. Being smart enough to stay in business for this year basically marks 40 years, which is amazing in the game industry, where to make it 10 years is a rarity. So all of those things, I think, are worth respect. Now, let's talk about some of the dark sides just to close out here. Looking to the future. Is it possible that this next edition, which has been rumored to have big changes, is the edition that finally does what I was talking about and changes the game too much? Yeah, that's possible. Change is a tough thing with games. You're trying to nail this perfect point, because too little, it's not exciting enough, too much, your churn goes too high. So it is the ultimate little Price is Right red, Spectrum game. Like, you really have to nail it. But I don't know for sure that that's what's happening, because we don't know anything for sure. Of course, the big problem is the one thing that I think they are truly guilty of is that lack of communication. So I do wish they would do that more. But we don't know yet. And I think the reality of it is, when you look at the long story of Games Workshop, it's a company that through a lot of trial and travail has made the right choices to keep their games successful at all points in time and constantly be bringing new people into the hobby. In the late 90s, the biggest gaming company in the world in the role playing and that space, and were in that sort of miniatures game, wasn't Wizards of the Coast with Magic and Pokemon. It was Games Workshop with Warhammer and Warhammer 40K. That's how big they were. And you got, like, Magic was so big, and yet they were still bigger. So they've negotiated these very dangerous waters well, and they've consistently put out a quality product. They've raised the bar for the whole industry of what modeling can be, of what the miniatures you can collect and hobby with is, while all the time either lagging behind on the prices, like, again, a new game that just comes out can set its prices crazy high, and, they didn't have a price increase. They just were able to start high. And at the same time, keeping their games fun and consistent. So that's why, again, I think that we should at least give them the benefit of the doubt on this. Because though they've made some questionable decisions, on the whole, we're all still here and talking about this because they made more good decisions than bad ones. So, those are my thoughts. I'm sure that many of you would disagree, and that's okay. Put your comments below. Do try to stay civil. I don't want to get in a flame war or anything like that. If you have a very different opinion, I completely respect it. And so, talk about it below, and we'll see you next time. Thanks a lot.